My name is Noah Doherty and I work at Education Elements. I'm excited to talk today about how we can support the whole child in tomorrow's schools. This is a really big topic and we're going to focus on 3 key considerations. First, how do we create safe and emotionally supportive learning spaces for our students? Second, we want to recognize that SEL competencies really work best in the most rigorous learning experiences. And third, we want to design lesson activities that really encourage student voice and choice. We're going to talk about each of the challenges that surround these considerations. We're going to talk about the opportunities present, and we're really going to think holistically about how we create the kind of schools that can really support the whole child. To begin with, I want you to think about a time and place where you felt safe and emotionally supported. Maybe it was when you were learning in a classroom or a place of work or a social or community group you've been a part of. For me, I think about the very best team I've ever worked on, which is when I taught 8th grade social studies. We were all newer teachers, but very quickly we developed a deep level of trust and understanding between us. We could really see the unique value that each of us brought to the team, and we leaned on those strengths in our work. This is also the first time when I wasn't afraid to fail in front of my colleagues. I could have a lesson that didn't go well, or I could have a student relationship that needed to improve, and I was never worried about hiding that from my team. Because 1, I knew they would never sidestep that issue, and 2, I knew they would always be there to support me. I grew so much when I was on that team, and it was because that space was so supportive and safe. And I've often thought about that team as I moved to a different school and different places of work. I thought about that team when I wanted to make my classroom a safe space for students to share writing feedback with one another. I've thought about that team when I've worked with colleagues on a new project, especially when we run into an unforeseen challenge. This is why we start with self-reflection when thinking about creating safe and emotionally supportive spaces. Our own experiences can illustrate the power and potential of those spaces. When our personal journey reinforces the why behind this consideration, it is all the more powerful. I want you to take time to really reflect about a time and place where you felt safe and emotionally supported. What was the context of that place? How did it empower you? How have you tried to recreate that kind of space for others? What was the impact of that space for you? What might be the impact of that space for students? A very quick note. The inverse of this self-reflection question can provide a helpful contrast. When we think about safe and emotionally supportive spaces, we can compare them to spaces that have felt judgmental or unsupportive, tense, or uncaring. Now, while that contrast can be helpful, we shouldn't focus on the inverse of it. Creating a safe and supportive space isn't about the absence of something. It's about the very intentional inclusion of something. It's not enough to say, I won't be judgmental in this space. We have to intentionally include opportunities for self-reflection, for the celebration of mistakes, to really create that kind of safe and supportive space. The Aspen Institute is a policy and think tank that created the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. In 2019, they released their report From a Nation at Risk to a Nation of Hope. In that report, they write, "It is a mistake to view social and emotional learning as a soft approach to education. Quite the opposite. An emphasis on these capacities is not the sacrifice of rigor, it is the source of rigor." When we think about SEL competencies as separate from academic standards, we create the risk that we'll prioritize one over the other. Instead, we must shift our approach to recognize the deeply symbiotic relationship between these two. If we're to develop competencies such as self-awareness or responsible decision-making, we have to engage students in learning experiences that allow them to apply, analyze, and practice those skills. You can't teach responsible decision-making by simply defining it at the remember level. However, you can ask students to apply that practice. They can analyze the complex considerations involved in responsible decision-making, and they can reflect on their own decisions and the decisions of others in an effort to evaluate how responsible they were. Let's imagine a social studies classroom where we use something like the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I as an opportunity to evaluate the decisions made by world leaders. Was it a responsible decision to require Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and pay massive reparations to the Allied powers? This question requires students to really think about how they define responsibility for themselves. They have to consider the competing responsibilities the world leaders felt and the impact of that decision. This is just one way that a rigorous activity can authentically involve SEL competencies. Prioritizing SEL competencies in the classroom goes hand in hand with increasing the rigor of those same classrooms. We must adjust our language to name this truth and create systems and expectations that help educators plan for both when designing learning experiences. Thinking about the school of tomorrow requires us to consider the jobs of tomorrow. And these jobs require a different set of skills than the ones we've traditionally prepared students to develop. The global management consulting company McKinsey published a discussion paper about the future of work titled Skill Shift: Automation and the Future of the Workplace. In their analysis of the skills that employers will look for, they found that between 2016 and 2030, demand for social and emotional skills will grow across all industries by 26%. Addressing the needs of the whole child isn't just helpful today, it is setting our students up for success in the workplace tomorrow. Why are social and emotional skills increasing in importance? Primarily, it's because of the increased importance of advanced technologies like automation and artificial intelligence. As automation expands and artificial intelligence continues to improve, social and emotional skills will become even more important. This is because these are the skills that we simply cannot program into a computer. While machines may be taking some of our jobs, they're also making the most human part of them more important than ever. What can we as educators do to prepare our students for the jobs of tomorrow? We can begin by giving our students greater voice and choice in their work. Allowing students to have more say and control over how they practice their work and how they demonstrate mastery creates the space to build critical SEL competencies. Voice and choice is a simple shift in our tactics and planning that can have an outsized impact on our students.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm a former teacher and school administrator, and I'm now an associate partner at Education Elements.
I'm Maria. I'm a design principal here at Education Elements, and I'm a former blended learning coach and middle school math teacher.
Since March 2020, the United States, along with the rest of the world, has been living through a once-in-a-century experience. A global pandemic that's upended everybody's lives. Even those of us who are among the more fortunate living through this period in history, we've still had upheavals in our lives that impact our health, our economic security, and the way we work and learn. In this context, supporting students who are experiencing trauma can be especially challenging for educators. As educators, we know that every interaction that we have with a student is really either a deposit or a withdrawal from a quality relationship with that student. So every interaction that you have with a student has an impact. So understanding the impact that trauma has on the brain and how the language and actions that we take and we use with students can impact their development is really critical, because right now everybody's undergoing a traumatic event as we speak. And as the adults and people who support children, there are some things that we can do for students to model regulating their emotions, which will enable them to have their minds in a space where they can learn. One of the first things you'll need to be able to do, though, is recognize, what does trauma look like in an educational setting or in a classroom? It can look a bunch of different ways. What does it look like when a child can't regulate his or her emotions? It can show up as anxiety, grief, acting out, or acting in, like withdrawal. And when we're thinking about emotional regulation, it doesn't mean suppressing or not feeling the emotions. Regulating emotions means that you experience the emotions and you can process them and cope with them in a way that's appropriate to the context. So when a student is unable to regulate their emotions, they might respond to things that you don't notice. I can think of some examples, like if you are with a student and you can see that they're just getting really furious, and you say, "Is everything okay?" And the answer you get is, "He was looking at me." And you look at the person and you say, "Well, he's not looking at you anymore." And the student can't come back and say, "Oh, okay." What the student does instead is say, "He was looking at me." That means they're having a reaction that's disproportionate to the circumstance that happened. A kindergartner who might retreat behind the bookcase to take a nap in the middle of the day. That's withdrawal activity. So that's a student who's chosen to withdraw because they can't cope with their emotions. A high schooler who has a tearful reaction to something that seems like a minor altercation. That also may be evidence of a lack of emotional regulation. And as we're reviewing sort of the evidence of a lack of emotional regulation, one thing to consider that's really important is that regulation is not a character trait. It's a skill set. So if you are somebody who regulates your emotions well, that is a skill that you learned. You may be temperamentally a little more go with the flow than some people, and there are some temperamental differences, but everybody is capable of learning how to regulate their emotions. So the charge for us is, knowing that everybody's capable of learning how to regulate their emotions, we need to teach these skills to students and then support them as they practice them, and we need to model them as well. This is all in service of making sure that students have the mental space and the receptiveness to learning when they need to be learning. When students are dysregulated, they pay attention to things like body language and nonverbal cues, not so much to the language that you're offering to reason them out of this state of mind.
The first way that you can support students' social emotional learning and their development is by building strong relationships with them. So we all know that relationships are really the basis for learning. If you're a classroom teacher, you definitely know that. And that's especially true when we're thinking about social emotional learning and supporting children's regulation. Meeting the need for connection can be challenging for teachers in a typical year, but it's magnified this year by the fact that students and teachers might be in different places on different schedules. We don't have that informal time to build relationships with students like at lunch or in the hallway or as they enter the classroom. Or even if you're in the building, you might have the challenge of physical distancing, not being able to check in with students. Even with these constraints, there are some high leverage opportunities that you as an educator can use to strengthen your relationship with students, whether that's in a distance learning environment or in a hybrid environment. The second piece is supporting students with emotional regulation so that their brains can focus on learning. When we help students to regulate, we're supporting the part of their brain that allows them to process complex material like language so that their brains are better able to process academic content. As a teacher, having a calm and more importantly, a consistent presence, building routines and really leveraging those routines, telling students if a change is coming, what's going to happen next, and most of all, building strong relationships with them can really help students with emotional regulation. Having a routine can be like an anchor for students' brains. They know what's coming next, it's predictable, they don't have to stress out or worry about the immediate future because they know that there's a schedule, they know that there is a routine, and that's easy for their brain to follow. The last piece that we'll talk about today is something that adults really need too, and if you're a teacher, you are definitely familiar with how important this is. Consistency. Consistency, similar to the way that you use routines, can help provide a safe and stable environment that helps students' brains regulate, and then they can actually focus on learning. So as a teacher, as you're creating and maintaining this learning environment, focusing on minimizing the unpredictable elements of your learning environment can go a long way in supporting students with their emotional regulation. Providing an agenda, following a schedule, and then providing students reminders of what's coming up next, what's coming up later in the day, what's coming up later in the week can really support their emotional regulation. An example of when things are unpredictable and it can be hard to focus that maybe you can relate to, it's definitely true for me, is when I'm driving and I get lost. Suddenly, because I'm trying to process the unpredictability of being lost, I'm trying to follow a map, I'm trying to not hit the car in front of me, my brain cannot process that extra sensory input of music or of sound, and I have to turn it down right away. Another big piece when it comes to consistency, which if you're a teacher you already know, is your emotional consistency and your consistency in responding to students. By having a consistent emotional response as the adult, you are not only modeling for them what it looks like to regulate your emotions, but you're also helping them to regulate, which is called co-regulation. A metaphor for this from the Momentous Institute in Houston is to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. So if your student or your students are emotionally dysregulated, they're having an outsized response, they're dysregulated going up and down. If you match them and you match their dysregulation by becoming dysregulated yourself, then you are being the thermometer. And we're not modeling for students how to regulate our emotions as the adult that's in the space. However, if you are as emotionally consistent as you can be, you're modeling for students what it can look like to emotionally regulate, and you're helping them to regulate their own emotions by providing that sense of safety, that security in their emotional response. So a few strategies that you can do to help students regulate starting with their body is start every class or every session with a body calming activity like the pancake breaths. You could also use something like a bead counter where students are counting beads. You can use the little glitter thing where you flip it upside down and they watch the glitter settle. One exercise that I love and I do for myself that I learned from my therapist is to count the number of blue objects in a room. So I'll look for 5 blue objects, and then I'll look for 4 red objects. And just that act of slowing down, looking for something that's in the space can help me regulate, can help your students regulate, and be more present and deal with those emotions. Anytime that you're using one of these techniques, you really want to pay attention to how your students are responding. You never want to force them to do something that they're uncomfortable to do, but we can provide these techniques as a way for students to learn how to regulate their own emotions and find one that works for them. So, how will you be a thermostat for your students and not a thermometer? So we encourage you to plan as you're looking at your lessons, as you're looking at the week or the unit that's coming up. How can you build in those principles of being consistent, being emotionally regulated, giving students an opportunity to learn those skills to help them emotionally regulate into your upcoming units?
Thank you for watching and for the work that you're doing with your students and your school community. We hope this overview of how trauma might appear in your classroom and those strategies that you can employ to support your students was helpful for you.
If you liked this video, let us know below with a like or a comment, and make sure that you subscribe and visit our website to check out more videos and resources.